Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully having an amazing day. As you are likely aware, the internet has just been ablaze recently with PS5 Pro news. We actually had a pretty substantial leak which popped up a couple of days ago, detailing a couple of aspects of the console, and we also now have the codename Trinity. Well, we actually have now allegedly more specifications which have popped up via Twitter. I'll go into them in just a moment, but first, just in case you did miss the old information, basically Tom Henderson, and he has a pretty damn good track record, including, of course, you know, the new PlayStation Q Lite and all of that stuff he's leaked, so he has a pretty good track record. He stated that we're looking at up to 30 workgroup processors, that's 60 compute units, and the memory speed of 18,000 MTS, and again, the codename Trinity, with the console launching essentially November 2024. This actually matches up very nicely with a lot of the information that I've put out about the PS5 Pro. Early last year, I was stating that I'd heard a performance target of roughly 2 times in raster, 2.5 times for ray tracing. I again stated it was going to be sometime in late 2024 with the release date. And more recently, in a video, I think it was in May, I'd heard 30 workgroup processors was the total number on the APU. I had very tentative information, so I basically just said, you know, that's probably what it is, but I didn't want to source it because, again, I wasn't 100% certain, but a couple of sources did tell me that it was most likely going to be 30. And it was going to be based essentially around Zen 4 for the CPU IP and RDNA 3 hybrid. I'm going to be doing a much deeper video, kind of diving all into the intricacies of the PS5 Pro. I'm working on that in a very different perspective. I want to talk to you guys more about what this could actually mean in terms of how the PS5 Pro is going to change games and some of the specification stuff and other bits and pieces. However, that's going to be a video which is probably going to take a couple more days to work on because I'm still trying to iron out a couple of details from my sources. But I did get tagged a couple of people, as well as DM'd by several people concerning these specifications. And Liquid Titan on Twitter is who's posted them. However, these are not originating with him. Instead, these apparently originate with someone who leaked the original PS5 specs back in 2019. There are, however, a few issues I do have with these specifications. Let's ignore the T-flops for a moment, and actually we're kind of going to work through this in a weird-ass way. The compute units, allegedly there are 54 with 60 total, so there are 6 disabled. So to get the number of compute units, you basically double the workgroup processor. So if there's 30 workgroup processors, you multiply it by 2, and obviously 30 multiplied by 2, using complicated maths, is 60. So here they are saying that out of the 60 which are on the APU, there are 6 disabled. I have to say I am a little skeptical at that. I have heard a lot of mixed things regarding how many actual compute units or workgroup processors, if you prefer, are actually enabled. Some of my sources are telling me the 30 number is actually the full complement that is enabled and there are more on the die. But more are telling me that no, 30 workgroup processors is the total number on the die. However, not all are active, and there are going to be a few disabled. And I've personally heard around 28 being enabled, so 28 out of the 30. This is very similar to what we had with the PS5, for example, which has 36 compute units active. However, there are 40 on the die. In the Xbox Series X, there are 52 compute units active, 56 on the die, and they do this for things like yield purposes. So basically, when you are producing a crap ton of silicon, that silicon has to basically hit criteria. It's a very complicated thing to go into, so I'm going to go over that really briefly, and this is not going to be 100% technically accurate, but for example, obviously you can't have defective CPU cores or GPU cores. If you need like all of them to be enabled, you can't just have like, you know, 7 CPU cores on a console which is supposed to have the specification of 8, and it obviously needs to hit certain clock frequencies. There are other considerations as well, like does it do so if you're putting a certain amount of voltage through? What about heat? There are all of these other concerns. So what they typically do, especially with the GPU cores, is they just kind of overbuild it, and then let's say a couple of them are defective. It doesn't matter because, well, you've got that buffer, you've got a little bit of spare. But anyway, getting back to the performance here, they're saying that there's 16 T-flops. I'm really skeptical of that. That's a very small increase in performance over the base model. Now, yes, there will be GPU efficiency improvements, and yes, you cannot directly compare T-flops with one architecture to another, but it just doesn't make sense to me because you can do the math yourself. In this instance, you would do 54 multiplied by 64, which is the number of shaders per compute unit, and then you would multiply that by 2, and then if you put in like 2300, that basically gets you 15.9 T-flops. So they're basically saying it's around 16 T-flops, which would essentially mean you've only got like 100 megahertz over the base model. I would be very skeptical that that is the clock frequency that Sony wrangled out of this thing. I think it's going to be much higher. All of the info that I've had puts it at least a couple of 100 megahertz above this, like 2500, 2600. In fact, I've even heard a little more. At this point, an exact frequency is quite difficult to nail down because they would have not figured it out yet. It would be much later in the production cycle when they're kind of getting closer to mass production. That's when clock frequencies are pretty close to being finalized. And we saw that, for example, you can go back to Xbox One. That's a good example, where Microsoft, when the consoles were kind of getting ready for mass production, quite late into the Xbox One's, cycle at that point, it wasn't like they had like 12 months to go until the system was going to hit the shelves, but they were like, oh, you know what, our yields are actually better than expected, so we're going to go ahead and raise the GPU clock frequency, and we're going to go ahead and raise the CPU clock frequency. So, I wouldn't put a huge amount of stock in clock frequencies right now. They also state that there's only a small increase in CPU speed. Again, I think a small increase, I would be pretty skeptical. I think probably it's going to be around 3.6, 3.8, but again, it's very difficult to have an exact prediction at the moment. The CPU I've heard is based on Zen 4. Zen 5 will have been out for probably, well, Zen 5 is going to launch next year on desktop. So, I don't know, the PS5 and Zen 5 might actually release about the same time. But from what I'm hearing, it's Zen 4 for the PS5, not Zen 5. It's basically to do with how production cycles work. To what I've heard, Viola, which is probably the code name for the PS5's APU, it is essentially based on Zen 4 and RDNA 3 kind of hybrid. Memory is 2 gigabytes of DDR5 memory and 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. Now, a source has told me that the PS5 Pro does have DDR5 memory in it. However, only a single source has told me that. All others have just said, no, it's 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. I could probably imagine that DDR5 memory could be present, and that would be essentially used for OS. The PS4 Pro did the same thing. They had not DDR5 memory, I think it was DDR3 from memory. That was a lot of memories. But basically what that would mean is you would essentially chuck some of the OS data into this, should I say. I think 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 is probably okay. This would be the same type of clock frequency memory as they're using in some of the RDNA 3 GPUs, by the way. The RX 7600, they're using it there, although they've only got a few memory modules on this, so it's only running at 128-bit bus, but they would just double the number of modules, and they would hit obviously the 256-bit bus that they're running here, so that's absolutely no problem. I'm also a little skeptical. Another reason that I'm a little skeptical on the GPU only running at the speed, and I don't have enough information to know what the ROP number is. I've not been given the ROP number, but basically what the ROPs do is they assemble the image. So what they do essentially is a lot of stuff to do with, the final stages of the rendering. They pretty much are full rate based, and when it comes to things like ROPS, the pixel fill rate can make an absolutely massive difference on certain aspects of things, especially when you're dealing with increased resolution. And basically, when it comes to ROPS, they are directly proportional, the fill rate that is, to the number of ROPS multiplied by the clock frequency. There are some other things that go into it in real world, but yeah, I'm not 100% convinced with these specifications, basically. They sound kind of ballparkish, but who knows? I mean, personally, I think they sound a little, the word I'm looking for, I guess, is anemic. Having said that, one reason I could potentially say that they might be legitimate is if you were to look at the price, they are stating $500. And one thing I did hear about the specifications that I was initially hearing about the performance targets is that the console was going to be quite expensive. Like, add like another $100 on top of this, maybe more. So maybe Sony have just basically decided, well, we don't want to build a system that expensive with, you know, all the cost of living at the moment. So what we're going to do is basically go a more conservative route. Personally, I don't think that these are legitimate. I think that the number of compute units is too few. I think that there is not enough of an increase in GPU performance, and I'm also a little skeptical on a couple other things, but who the hell knows? Well, that's just my quick takeaway. I'll be going much deeper into this with some of the specs that I've been hearing from some of my sources. Again, a couple of my sources leaked stuff way back in, you know, early last year, and a couple of them also told me things like 30 workgroup processors in May of this year. So I do think some of the information that I have been receiving is pretty close to being accurate. I just don't want to say too much in this video, not because, you know, of any other reason other than I want to just try to find out one or two more things I'm not 100% comfortable saying at the moment. With that said, guys, thank you very much for watching the video. I'll see you soon. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.